Linda explained most of my background. I uh, will tell you just a little bit more about the portfolio that I handled when I worked in Congress. So, for the past several years and through all of the turmoil of the pandemic, I was working on the House Financial Services Committee, and the portfolio that I oversaw was sort of all things Federal Reserve, so both monetary policy and financial stability, bank regulation, and then insurance, which in Congress mostly means dealing with the reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program.
Hmm.
And then finally, especially once President Biden took office, the oversight of a climate risk supervision framework by federal banking agencies. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that means tonight. And I left that job last summer to try to take those policies to the state level, particularly in states like Massachusetts that now have Democratic trifectas. And so we'll hopefully talk about the national landscape and some of the policies that I'm working on around the country, both good and not so good, things that we're trying to play defense against. But also, um, you know, there's so much going on in this moment across the financial system. So I'm happy to take questions around a range of topics. I will share my screen now and verify that it looks okay. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so mostly what I want to talk to you today about is climate change and how it's increasingly being understood as a threat to the safety and soundness of the financial system, and not just as an environmental crisis, but really fundamentally as an economic challenge that is going to shape economic policies and economic livelihoods for the rest of our lives. And in this context, it's generally understood when economists and financial regulators conceive of financial stability risks, they group climate risks into two major buckets. And those are physical risks and transition risks. And physical risks are losses that come to businesses and households and economic losses that are experienced as the result of increasingly severe floods, wildfires, storms, drought, all of the range of climate disasters that are escalating over time. And then transition risks are commonly known as commonly conceived in terms of stranded assets. That is, we know that fossil fuel companies have trillions of dollars in assets that are based on an expectation of future profits that can't possibly come to pass if we are to keep warming to a safe 1.5 C level as ratified through the Paris agreements in 2015. And so if those assets are not to be combusted, what is the lost value and what is the exposure that banks, insurance companies, and all of the counterparties to that may hold assets and may have stock or other assets with those fossil fuel companies, what's the exposure that they can expect when those profits and those expectations don't come to pass. And it's important to recognize that although this is generally understood as transition risk only comes to pass if we shift to a policy framework that is consistent with a 1.5C future, that's not actually the only form of transition risk. There can be a disorderly transition, even if policymakers don't align policy with climate objectives, and that could take the form of consumers very dramatically and quickly changing their preferences in response to climate change. It can also take the form of a more rapid than expected technological development. And there's even scarier scenarios. Transition risk can sort of happen one way or another if warming really sort of starts to cause civilizational instability. And so I also want to point out that these physical risks and transition risks are translated onto the state budget and investment portfolio map pretty neatly. As climate disasters escalate, you're also seeing state budgets and state governments deal with the cost. Sounds like someone's listening to.
The committee initially
you just mute
16
people.
members, and now we have about 10 to 12.
I think it might be Elizabeth.
Our first stated goal was one of directed
Elizabeth, mute.
Okay. Yeah, so on the left-hand side, you see this is from a Pew report that came out last November that showed the growing costs that state budgets are facing from wildfires. And then on the right-hand side, you see this is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. They put out a report in early 2021. And it was all about the shortfalls that state budgets were dealing with during the COVID-19 recession. And in March of 2020, when the recession first began and the pandemic first began, there were these really terrifying $1 trillion plus shortfalls that were projected for state and local governments. And thankfully, those did not come to pass for the most part. Mostly because the economy recovered faster than expected, and the American Rescue Plan included hundreds of billions of dollars in federal aid to state and local governments. But there were some governments that did experience some pretty pronounced shortfalls, as this report showed, and those governments were Alaska, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado. And those states have one thing in common, which is huge dependence on fossil fuel revenue to balance their budget. So that's sort of transition risk. Now, in May of 2021, President Biden issued an executive order that tasked the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is a Dodd-Frank created consortium of federal financial regulators that was created after the 2008 financial crisis, with exploring and examining climate as a financial stability threat. And in October of 2021, that report was produced, and it detailed the numerous ways in which climate change is posing a financial stability threat. And Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary, and as Treasury Secretary chairs the FSOC, has spoken out numerous times since about climate as it's starting to be conceived as a financial stability threat. And so what's being put into place is a framework, and various regulators have begun enunciating how they are going to start mitigating climate as a financial stability threat to businesses, to banks, to insurance companies, and to households. The Department of Labor was one of the first to begin acting. They finalized a rule in December that clarified that private pension fund managers may consider climate and social factors in determining what is in the fiduciary interest of pension fund investors. That rule, even though it actually isn't all that prescriptive, has provoked a ton of controversy. And you may have heard that week before last, Congress, including 2 Democrats in the Senate, voted to invoke the Congressional Review Act and overturn that rule. And so that is what's prompting President Biden's first ever veto. Another rule, which is, I think, in many ways a lot more important, is that the SEC issued a proposal last March that's expected to be finalized sometime this spring that requires publicly traded companies to disclose their exposure to climate risk across a range of fronts. There have been other actions by the Federal Reserve, OCC, FDIC, and Federal Insurance Office, but I'll go into more detail about those later. I guess I've been talking for a little while now. Maybe this would be a good place to pause as I start to dig into how the federal work is translating to the state work. Does anyone have any questions about anything I've said so far? Okay. Well, then I will move on to the states. I'm going to go through this section a little bit more quickly because it's a little bit less relevant to Massachusetts. But I alluded to this when I spoke about the Congressional Review Act. So there has been an effort over the past several years, funded largely by the fossil fuel industry, to frame socially responsible investing, which is sometimes called ESG investing, which stands for environmental, social, and governance, as so-called woke capitalism. And state treasurers have been the main purveyors of this rhetoric, but they aren't the only ones. There have been a number of figures on the far right that have been engaging this. Leonard Leo from the Federalist Society, Peter Thiel, and then probably most famously Ron DeSantis gave a big woke capitalism speech last July. And this effort has really succeeded in slowing down a lot of the momentum toward climate financial regulation. It was a factor, I believe, in the Congressional Review Act vote in the Senate a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of fear amongst Republicans and even some Democrats. It's prevented 2 of President Biden's financial regulatory appointees who were appointed or nominated in 2021 from being confirmed. And it even has it's even playing a role this week in the whole Silicon Valley Bank failure. The Silicon Valley Bank failure is a confluence of both monetary policy and regulatory policy failures on the part of the Federal Reserve and FDIC, but that hasn't prevented the Ron DeSantis and others from claiming that the reason why Silicon Valley Bank failed is that they were pursuing all these diversity initiatives and have been investing in woke investments. This, of course, is complete nonsense, but it has gained traction amongst some congressional Republicans, and the irony, one of the ironies about it, is that the Silicon Valley Bank run was quite literally initiated by Peter Thiel, a venture capitalist who is himself a very prominent anti-ESG financier. They have been introducing and passing legislation to tamp down on socially responsible investing in a huge number of states. Five laws have passed just since January. 7 states passed some form of anti-ESG legislation last year. There have been 133 variations of attacks on climate financial regulation and socially responsible investing introduced in about 30 states just since January 1st. I could go into more detail about that, but I actually don't want to dwell on that too much, because one of the main things I want to say about it is that we have done a lot of message testing and strategizing around how to fight back against this very pernicious movement. And one of the insights we've gotten is that we really need to be enacting proactive policies that protect retirees from climate risk. And this map displays some of the legislation that's been introduced in Dem trifecta states. And as you can see, it's substantially less than the progress, so to speak, that has been seen in Republican-led states. It sounds like someone was maybe going to ask a question.
And I just had a question. When you said that those 95, referring to those 95 bills that are in some way against climate risk financial regulation, were those passed? You said since January. Is it that since January of 2023? They were passed.
It's pretty amazing just to give a sense of how intense this onslaught has been. This graphic here is actually only 2.5 weeks old, and it's already totally out of date. So it says 95 bills. It's actually 133 at this point, and those have been bills that have been introduced just since January 1st, 2023. Since you asked, I'll go into a little bit of detail about what these bills do. So one bill, these are model bills promoted by the Heritage Foundation and the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. And they have the first one to pass was Texas in 2021. They passed a bill called the Energy Discrimination Elimination Act, which prohibits state governments from doing business with financial institutions that the treasurer deems to, or the state comptroller deems to be engaged in a boycott against fossil fuels. The financial institutions that have been labeled in Texas as boycotting fossil fuels are the giant institutional investors that have the biggest impact on the financial market in general. So BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, UBS, these big banks and asset managers have been accused by Texas state officials of engaging in a boycott against fossil fuels, when in fact they aren't engaged in a boycott of fossil fuels. What they're really doing is using a very common methodology of risk analysis that is sometimes called ESG. And Walmart, Coca-Cola, Bank of America, these big corporations, they use ESG analysis sometimes to determine how resilient their supply chains are, or whether they should shift where they are acquiring their water or other things that they need to create the products that they're selling. And that's hardly that's just sound business practice, but it's being depicted as woke capitalism and used as a pretext to say that institutions like BlackRock, which are continuing to finance fossil fuels, are supposedly engaged in a woke boycott against fossil fuels. The other major piece of model legislation, which is starting to become more common and tends to be the preferred approach that Republican legislators are now pursuing, is a pretty similar sentiment, but goes about it in a slightly different way. It sort of prohibits state fiduciaries and the state treasurer or any other managers of public pension funds from using what they consider to be non-pecuniary or non-financial factors. And so the way that they, I mean, that's sort of in the eye of the beholder. The way that they are interpreting it is to say that if you consider how a mortgage might be affected by sea level rise, you are engaged in speculative behavior that isn't intrinsic to the financial value of that asset, when in fact it's sort of very relevant to the financial value of that asset. But that's basically the premise. It's pretty absurd, but unfortunately it's been enacted in a number of states and is still pending in several dozen.
Thank you.
I want to let's see. Okay, so it's I'm about halfway through here. So I guess I'll just briefly describe some of the polling that I alluded to before. The reason why this campaign, I think, has been so prevalent in Republican circles, and CPAC was just a couple weeks ago, and woke capitalism was a dominant topic there, is that Republicans have sort of landed on an insight that that ESG has a ton of similarities to critical race theory. And we've confirmed that there are some similarities in some of the research that we've done. And this slide displays basically how much people know or have even heard of the term ESG. And as you can see, very few people have. It is similar to critical race theory in that it is a mostly academic acronym that actually means different things to different people, and so is very possible as a sort of blank canvas for politicians to paint on with a bunch of misinformation. But there is some reason for hope. There gets to be a point where the similarities to critical race theory start to end. There are some rifts that have emerged. The Chamber of Commerce in some states has spoken out against these bills. The state banking associations in a number of states have spoken out against these bills. The Kentucky Bankers Association actually issued a very powerful lawsuit against the Kentucky Attorney General for enforcing their anti-ESG law. And their reasoning is basically, you're prohibiting us from factoring in meaningful risk factors that influence our decision making across important components of our business. And so, although I don't want to overstate the extent to which this has created space between, free market business conservatives and the Republican base, because I frankly don't believe that that there are that many sound business conservatives in the Republican Party anymore. It is important to note that if you had asked me last fall how many of these laws would have gone into effect by mid-March, I probably would have given a number higher than 5. And so this has been slowed down, and there have been some fractures that have emerged, and it isn't totally clear that this is carrying the same resonance among Republican voters that critical race theory did. You're not seeing people show up to pension fund board meetings in the same way that you were seeing people show up to school board meetings in Fairfax County, Virginia, and so forth. There's also a huge amount of public support for supporting the energy transition that is already underway, and for making sure that public assets and public funds and retirement money is invested in a way that is going to be integrated with the economic benefits of that transition. And very importantly, and this is something I want to get into a little bit of detail with you, because Massachusetts is a very relevant place for this. Insurance policy seems to be a key area to help the public understand both the concepts behind climate financial regulation and the hazards of an unregulated and unmanaged climate transition. As the climate crisis has escalated, we've begun to see not only more climate disasters, but we've also seen that insurance companies are increasingly engaged in denials, policy withdrawals, delays, and cancellations. And insurance is the one sort of thing that you pay for in your life that you hope that you don't use. And people, when they're presented with this idea that they might have paid a monthly or annual premium for years and years and years, and then when something bad happens to their home or their car or whatever, that their insurance company might just say, too bad, or find some kind of legal way of finagling out of paying that obligation. People are very outraged, and that's exactly what's happening all around the country right now. And so this is a sort of underappreciated component of state policy.
Question?
Yes.
Jordan, could you give a couple examples of that insurance? Because I think you're right. That's where people will really feel, understand the concept of. So are you aware of people who've had either flood insurance or home insurance, fire insurance is under your homeowners, where the insurance companies have declined payment because of why? Because
yeah. So yes, I'll give a few concrete examples, but often it's not the case necessarily that the insurance company will deny coverage altogether. But what is very common is underpayment, and really, really onerous premium coverage increases. But what when you file an insurance claim, there then begins a dance of the insurance company saying, well, we don't want to pay all of this. So yes, you had this policy, but here's this clause that says that we don't have to pay in such and such a circumstance, or we don't have to pay all of this in such and such a circumstance. And so that is really what we're seeing a whole lot of right now. And concrete example occurred after Hurricane Ida in October 2021. Hurricane Ida hit Louisiana, and then went on to the Northeast. But it was expected to miss New Orleans. And so in the days leading up to Hurricane Ida making landfall, the governor issued a disaster declaration that didn't include the city of New Orleans. Well, then the storm changed course at the very last minute and ultimately did end up hitting New Orleans. And so there were many homes in New Orleans that were damaged, and many of those homeowners had policies with State Farm, which insures a little over 20% of the market in Louisiana. And they denied claims to residents of New Orleans who they had policies with, because there was a clause in those policies that said that they would only pay out in governor declared disaster areas, and New Orleans hadn't been included in the disaster area. And Louisiana's insurance commissioner, who's a Republican, actually tried to challenge State Farm on this, and that went through litigation for over a year. And ultimately, the Louisiana insurance commissioner lost. State Farm was found to have legally not done anything wrong. And that's basically how insurance policy works in a lot of different places. And so that's why I think it's an area that's very ripe for reform.
Thank you.
Any other questions on that?
Oh, Anatole, you're muted. You have to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was recently article in the Boston Globe about several houses in North Carolina fell into the sea without even hurricane, just a storm. If this households had insurance, do you think they would be paid?
Yeah, I mean that's a very that's a complicated question. I mean, it varies so widely on a case by case basis. Most homeowners are required to obtain some form of property insurance, but whether it follows every single hazard is unclear. And you're seeing in a lot of places, even in the absence of a hurricane, there's coastal erosion, there's sea level rise, and so I wouldn't be surprised if you're really like in a beachfront community, I would hope that the insurance policy that you obtain when you move into your home would cover something like that. But the climate change is imposing all sorts of difficult to predict scenarios. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of cases where someone lives in an area that didn't expect to see the sorts of things that they're starting to see.
But the number of these houses are increasing. 16 of them were already demolished in Plymouth, for example, Massachusetts. So there's something got to give here. Something needs to be. will have to be done with insurance.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
I see Nicola has her hand raised. Would you?
Oh, yes, thanks for this information. It's really useful. I was just wondering about more broadly socially responsible investment and
Yeah.
how that is what you do is related to how our pension funds might be invested, and if we can do anything to support better investment of our pension funds in this kind of socially responsible funds.
Yes. Well, it depends on um whether you're a public worker or you work in the private sector, how much can be done about where your investments are made from a public policy standpoint. But what really has sparked off this whole firestorm over socially responsible investing is just the development of ESG products dating back to the early 2000s when people in the investment community realized that people were retiring and wanted their retirement money to be segmented it off from things that they didn't necessarily agree with. And so what typically like happens is that a big asset manager like Vanguard or BlackRock or State Street will offer ESG indexes that can be tailored to different different preferences. But there's a lot of what is typically called greenwashing in this industry.
That's what I'm worried about. Yeah, right.
It's you really have to do a lot of research to it's not enough to just sort of call up your advisor at Vanguard and say, I want to shift my money to an ESG policy. They might say, okay. And then if you read the fine print, you think you're investing in a climate ESG index that actually, has, Exxon stock.
Right.
That's not always the case. Some ESG indexes are very, very good. But it isn't, but you really kind of have to do your own research. Now, the SEC issued a proposal last May that would have standardized what investment and advisors can frame as ESG policies, and would actually finally, for the first time, provide some definition around what is considered ESG and what isn't. But that rule hasn't been finalized, and that rule is also a part of this enormous backlash. So for the time being, the onus is really on private investors to do a lot of homework. And the other thing is that to point out is that everything that I just said is sort of framing things in a way that would be consistent with what the with what the critics of ESG accuse ESG of doing, which is imposing social values and moral considerations on something that should purely be a financial thing. But the fact is that there's a lot of research comparing ESG funds and their performance to non-ESG funds. And generally speaking, ESG funds perform as well, if not better. And that's only going to become more and more the case as the climate crisis imposes financial stability risks, it's not a good investment to be. You shouldn't really, shouldn't want your investment money to be with Peabody Coal. That's not going to work out for you.
But and the whole stranded assets thing is I
Yeah.
think is driving a lot of our politics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So I will return to the public pension fund subject in a moment, but I want to first just quickly talk about green banks. What I'm about to say in the next few slides is a sort of suite of climate financial policies that I think can be passed and adopted in states where there's strong political will to take climate financial action. And one of them is the most urgent, which is that the Inflation Reduction Act created a $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund that is going to be giving a set of grants both to state and local governments as well as to nonprofits, community development, financial institutions, and credit unions to support clean energy deployment and other purposes that reduce climate pollution. And the EPA guidance for this fund was released on February 14th. It didn't actually provide a whole ton of details, but there are a few different states that are considering right now passing bills that will create so-called green banks to serve as an investment vehicle for this federal money. Green banks are not brand new. They're not totally being created in response to this bill. The first green bank actually was started in Connecticut in 2011. So they predate the IRA, and it's probably a good idea to create them whether or not the IRA existed. But Massachusetts a couple of years ago created Clean Energy Technology Center, which was mostly meant to support offshore wind. And what I've heard is that all that needs to happen, I mean, this Clean Energy Technology Center, it's quasi-public, it has good governance, there's a lot of economic development data that goes into how they conduct their work. And so although probably something needs to be done to clarify that it can support a wider range of projects than just offshore wind, because the EPA guidance said that the $7 billion tranche of funds that is dedicated to state and local governments is primarily going to go toward solar rooftop and battery storage. And so if Massachusetts wants to be deemed eligible for that pot of money, they should probably do something to clarify that whatever a state agency receives that money is going to spend on solar rooftop and battery storage. There's also the whole $20 billion available that's expected to go towards some kind of grantee, could be a network of CDFIs or a big nonprofit, and that institution will in turn re-grant the money to agencies within the Massachusetts state government. And so what we think should happen, or what I think should happen, is Governor Healy needs to issue an executive order that specifically designates the Clean Energy Technology Center as the eligible recipient of greenhouse gas reduction funds. there's a few bills out there that would create
Question?
a new green bank in Massachusetts. And I'll get to the question in a moment. But from my understanding, I don't know that any of those bills are going to be passed in such a timely manner. And so it seems like the inclination is to go the executive order route. Yeah, what's the question?
Just could you explain what a green bank does?
Sure. Yeah. So the green bank is probably, I mean, it's probably not the right term. In fact, the Coalition for Green Capital, which is an organization that has been hugely instrumental in setting up green banks, and was a big part of the push to include this provision in the IRA, has actually admitted that green banks is kind of a confusing term because they apply it very widely. It can refer to anything from Connecticut's Green Bank, which is a state-run quasi-public institution whose leaders are chosen by the governor and by state legislative leaders, and supports with funding partially from the state government, a wide range of projects throughout Connecticut, anything that's deemed to be relevant to addressing climate change within Connecticut can be supported, to Florida, which has a small nonprofit in St. Lucie County that is called the Solar Energy Lending Facility, SELF. And they are just a program that helps low-income apartment owners in St. Lucie County, Florida, install solar on their rooftops, which is a great program, but doesn't exactly bring to mind everything that encompasses a green bank. But the fundamental purpose of green banks is to fill financing gaps that, because of short-termism within the financial sector, don't tend to receive support from banks and other financial institutions. So, a lot of the things that the IRA is really meant to incentivize, like energy efficiency upgrades, heat pumps, solar rooftop, these are projects that are very much in the interest and do produce returns and savings for consumers in the long term, but they're often not deemed to be worth the upfront investment costs in the short term, because the savings are spread out over such a long period of time. And so that's exactly the type of project that you don't tend to see a lot of banks step in to support, particularly in communities where ratepayers or apartment dwellers don't have a lot of income and therefore aren't viewed as reliable creditors. So this is the problem that green banks were designed to solve, and they have been serving a very useful function doing that in Connecticut, Colorado, Illinois, and other states.
Thank you. Any other questions while we're looking at questions? Okay.
I see that we only have a few more minutes, so I am going to, well, I think what I'll do is I'll spend a couple minutes talking about pensions, and then I'll spend a couple minutes talking about insurance. So on the pension fund front, there to return to the question that was asked about what public pensions can do to make sure that that they're recognizing financial stability risks and not supporting the fossil fuel industry. The Maine passed a bill last year that required the investment portfolio of Maine's pension funds to divest from fossil fuels by 2026. But there is a pretty big loophole in that they basically say, we're exempt from this if we determine that it's not in the fiduciary duty of Maine to withdraw some of these fossil fuel investments. And so, given that climate is increasingly being recognized as a financial stability risk, and that the stranded asset problem of fossil fuel investments is an important part of that risk, you can achieve a similar purpose by conducting a climate risk assessment of your investment portfolio and aligning the investment policies of your state with the conclusions of that climate risk assessment. And so Maryland passed a bill that did that last year, and similar bills have been proposed in Washington State and in Colorado. Colorado is the only bill that looks like it's going to move this year. There are a couple of bills related to fiduciary duty and greater consideration of climate risks that have been proposed in the Massachusetts legislature. And I can send those to you. But I was talking with Linda about this a few weeks ago. I don't exactly know what the strategy or intent of them is. They're a little bit different from the bills that I'm more familiar with. So I would love to be put in touch with the legislators or staffers who helped develop those bills and hear what the plan is. But I can't say at the moment that you have this bill SB 217 that you should all go and call your legislators and get passed. But I hope to be able to do that. And then just to pivot briefly to insurance. So we've talked a lot about insurance and how it's such an important channel for transmitting risk to the broader financial system. We talked a lot about the consumer hazards that come along with climate disasters. But the landscape is really kind of has a similar parallel to pension policy. Dem-controlled states are moving in one direction and Republican-controlled states are moving sharply in the other direction. Until last year, the only real climate insurance policy that was in place was that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners had a voluntary climate risk disclosure survey that 15 states, including Massachusetts, have opted into. So they ask their insurance companies to conduct a climate risk disclosure survey every year. But then last year, New York and Connecticut both adopted guidance that now requires insurance companies based in those two states to conduct scenario analysis, which is a tool that is common in the bank regulation context. And that basically you look at your balance sheet and you evaluate how it would change under different scenarios. So for instance, if an insurance company in New York is insuring a bunch of policies on Long Island that would be at risk of being underwater under certain sea level rise scenarios that are very plausible within a decade, they would have to note that and then submit what exactly their plan is to adjust to that. But unfortunately, insurance policies are set on an annual level. And so, quite frankly, insurance companies, I support this. I think that other states should pass scenario analysis because I think it reduces the chances that consumers are going to face these big hazards from premium spikes and withdrawals and whatnot. But I also think that what an insurance company might say in New York is, yes, we're insuring this policy on Long Island, and our answer to the fact that this home might be underwater in 5 years is that we're going to just start charging that homeowner 15% more next year and 15% more the year after that. And we are actually seeing that in New Mexico, for instance. It was a 13% premium spike across the board last year in response to all of their wildfires. And so there are other policies in Connecticut. A bill has been introduced called SB 1115 that actually imposes a surcharge on any new fossil fuel projects that an insurance company would underwrite. There's a number of different policies. I know we're out of time, so I won't get into them all. And I will also say that, quite honestly, this is such an area of ripe reform that a lot of the ideas are still under development. And I'm working with a lot of think tanks and advocacy organizations to continue to come up with ideas. So what I'm hearing from groups like yours in states from Massachusetts to California to New Mexico to Colorado is that they are hearing from a lot of people who both care about climate change and are seeing how it's affecting their insurance, but want to know what they can do about it and want to know if there is something that their state legislators can do about it. And the answer is that there is. And that's why I'm so glad that I got to talk to you all and would love to stay in touch about it.
So what I'd like to do is say, thank you so much, Jordan. I'd like to say, if Jordan has a few more minutes to hang around for questions, and those of you who need to get off, please feel free. And those of you who would like to hang around for some questions, because to me, this is such an important topic and it is hard to understand. So I'm recording this session and I'll send out a link when I have it up on YouTube, and some of you may want to listen to it again or just listen, go through it more, try to have it absorb. So some of the questions that come to my mind, Jordan, and you don't have to necessarily try to answer them all now, but do you know of any organizations in Massachusetts that are dealing with this issue? I saw you on a climate exchange forum. Are there any groups in climate organizations in Massachusetts that are on this issue? Second question would be, do you have any kind of editorial template or draft of something that we could do? I mean, if we could get some editorials published in local newspapers explaining this to laymen. Here's what ESG investment is. Here's what, the concern is that, there's a backlash saying that it's not, it's woke capitalism. And because people don't know what it means, they'll believe the person they trust. So that's the kind of thing that the climate lobby, as Citizens Climate Lobby, they provide a lot of draft templates. Here's a way to have here's a skeleton of a letter of an editorial column on different topics. So, because I think some of us would be willing to try to work this up and try to get it into Cape Cod Times or one of the local papers. And then I guess with respect to, what should we be asking our state legislators about? So that's a wide range of things, but I would like to stay in touch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the answer is, first, of course, we should definitely stay in touch. But I haven't talked that much to organizations within Massachusetts, although I was in touch with someone from Climate Reality Project a few weeks ago who met with Melissa Hoffer, who has
Mhm.
just been
Oh,
named
yes. yeah.
the governor's climate chief, and they
Mhm.
were specifically talking through all of these different needs and asks surrounding the greenhouse gas reduction fund.
Mhm.
I don't. I think I forwarded you some questions that I had recommended that they pose to Melissa Hoffer. I don't. I haven't heard what came out of that conversation, but that's a good thing because it's very active right now. And that's the most immediate thing, is that we need to make sure that the governor's office is looped into all the ways that they can make that clean energy technology center as powerful of a vehicle for years and years to come.
Yeah.
And then on the points that you raised about op-eds and such, I'd be happy to work with you on drafting an op-ed on this. I would say, like, I would suggest that you frame it, you know, obviously there's usually pretty rigid word restrictions. So it might be tough, but you know, try to frame it as pointing out all of the costs that are that, you know, politicians that are adopting the woke capitalism frame are imposing on their own constituencies. There's a lot of studies pointing to how this isn't actually good for returns, how it's raising debt servicing
Mhm.
costs
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
school board districts and the like. I just published a paper with the Roosevelt Institute last week that is basically, I would say, a guideline to an op-ed around that, because it starts with making that point, and then says, here's how people can be more responsible stewards of public pension funds. And I'll put that that report in the chat here.
Oh, thank you.
Elizabeth, your hand is up.
Hi, yeah, I think you had a great idea about having like the state auditor audit these green funds. Because my fear that is in Massachusetts, we have a legislature that is out of control and does whatever they want, not what the people want. Or we have a Senate that just gave the president, of the Senate a term as long as she wants it to be. Diane Zoglia is now, just announced that she's going to audit the legislature, which I love.
God bless her.
I am so happy about that. I campaigned for her, and she's a dynamo. And I think that's the only way to approach it, because I could see, starting an IRA green bank fund in Massachusetts and having it all go to National Grid.
God.
So they can like convert 400 houses a year instead of 100,000 over to heat pumps. I'm just sorry, I'm not going to take up any more time. An imposter from Salem who met Linda at the Citizens Climate Lobby convention a couple weekends ago. But that was a great, really good, informative. And my other comment on insurance is, I owned a veterinary practice. It's a wild west with the insurance on the flood insurance. My husband and I are about to drop ours. I had a veterinary practice where had to pay. It was in a flood zone. It did flood when we had northeasters on the street, and I built it up so it wouldn't flood when I built it. But I was paying like $2,001 or $2,000 a year in the early 2000s, and then I thought it was through the government, the FEMA, and then it went up to 7,000. It was out of some bank that was like, had some bogus name, like, Trust Us Insurance in Florida. And it was like $7,000 a year, but I was too busy practicing and trying to run my business to like notice. And then I finally shopped it around and I got a rate for $2,000 again. So my husband works for the EPA, and I doubt, like, we live between two rivers in Salem, Massachusetts. And if this place washed away, I'll bet you our insurance company would, and it was a total loss, and we didn't want to build back here. We wanted to build somewhere else. I'm just betting they would not give you any money, because you know, they'd have some clause that like, oh, you're not going to build on your spot that's underwater anymore, so we're not going to pay for it. I mean, that's what I would. So we're really ready to just like not pay our flood insurance in our home anymore because it's not in
Wow.
an absolute flood zone. But I definitely check if you live in Sandwich. I'd definitely be checking with your insurance company and say like, hey, in this scenario, if it washed away, what would you do? If I wanted to like move to Western Mass, would you build me a house in Western Mass? So that's
Yeah.
those are
That's
my
what
two
they ought
thoughts.
to let you do, for sure.
I don't know. That would be the right
Yeah.
thing, but the insurance companies don't do the right
Right,
thing.
they're trying to make a profit and they're looking for reasons that, you know,
Yeah,
not.
it's a battle. I
not
mean, I
to
have neighbors who
pay
had
things.
fires. It takes 3 years to get, if you have a fire in your house, and we have a neighbor across the street, it took 3 years. It always takes 3 years to rebuild.
Mhm.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, well, so a few things. First of all, I feel your pain. I worked in Sacramento for a couple of years before I moved to DC in the state legislature there. And so I'm very familiar with how some blue states can have this reputation for being a liberal haven, but actually, in fact, if you know anything about their state legislature, are deeply, deeply corrupt. And I know Beacon Hill is one of the premier examples of
Yes.
that nationwide. I do think that that only strengthens the case for finding ways to sort of work around it. And I think there are increasingly starting to be some recognition, and thankfully I'm I'm trying to drive this conversation more and more with state treasurers and state auditors um, and state and county officials about even conducting a climate risk assessment. Although I'm not normally someone who's like, ah, yes, this report is going to save the world. I actually think that that is a necessary step that where people unencumbered by the legislature can make a big difference. And so the climate risk assessment of the investment portfolio that Maryland utilized can be applied not just to the investment portfolio context, but to the budget context. And you all were probably following this far more than I was, but there's this guy who ran for auditor, Chris Dempsey, and he had like a pretty detailed climate platform for what he was going to do from the auditor position, which is how he came across my radar. But I you know, he lost the primary. But you know, he was a young guy. I might be, if you weren't already in touch with him, might be worth getting in touch with him.
Um,
I have trouble raising my hand sometimes, but I think what the woman from Salem is right, that a lot of these places don't allow you to build someplace else. And they were talking about in the paper even 6 months ago, these houses are falling into the sea and they still want you to build in the same place. Otherwise they won't cover it. So what can we do to change that? Because it's obviously
insane.
ridiculous.
Well, right. I mean, this was you know, sort of unfortunately was the bane of my existence when I worked for the committee, but the National Flood Insurance Program is besieged by many problems, most of which stem from climate change. And right now, the current process for obtaining an acquisition from FEMA and basically getting a buyout if your home is damaged or destroyed in an area that's so vulnerable to climate risk that it probably shouldn't be rebuilt. It's a 5-year process. And so what's happening many times, I'm sure this is the case in Massachusetts, I know it's the case certainly in Louisiana and other parts of the Bayou and the Gulf, is that, everyone likes to rag on these people who have lived in these communities for a long time for rebuilding in places that they shouldn't. But right now, there just aren't the resources for that not to be the sort of logical thing for them to do. Unfortunately, I mean, and so Congressman Sean Casten from Illinois has a bill that would reform this process and expedite the acquisition process. And it's not the sticking point that is holding up more long-term reforms that are preventing from Congress from passing a multi-year reauthorization that would put the flood insurance program on sounder footing. To talk about that, we would need another 5 hours probably. But but this bill is a really good bill, and it potentially, if it could be detached from the dysfunctional NFIP reauthorization process, might even have bipartisan support. So that bill that I just shared in the chat is a bill that you should, call your member of Congress and get them to co-sponsor.
Thank you.
I wonder, Jordan, if you know something about the so-called managed retreat in terms of coastal impact. I heard that the Fed is paying 75% of the relocation to the higher ground. Is that true? And is it changing, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I can't say I'm super well versed in what the specific figures are, but it relates back to the problem that I just mentioned. There is desire on FEMA's part to help communities relocate where that may be necessary, but there just aren't resources.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think on that
It seems
note,
like people should at least get the premiums back that they've been paid all these years, if nothing
I
else,
know.
right?
Put them
Yeah.
aside, put them in a fund. So I think, I know this is a complex subject and hard to follow, but I think it's so important. It's actually terrifying to me how fragile our economies are, and climate change is obviously got to be taken into consideration. So we'll keep on this, and we'll talk to you again, Jordan. So
Yes.
please, you know who we are, and I thank everyone who came. This was a great session. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And
I think we
you know,
all have to sell our vulnerable houses to people who think climate change isn't real.
There are still buyers out there. There's people who bought at the North Carolina banks like a year or two ago who are stunned their houses are washing into the ocean.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
know.
I sold mine in Charlestown, and not a single person thought two things about it. I'm like, yeah, this thing's going to be underwater. And
Yeah. Wow. Thank you, everyone.
That's a novel proposal. Thank you all so much. I just put my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me, and thanks again for all that you do.
Okay.
I had one more question.
Go ahead.
With the map of like all the red states and with the pitiful map of what the progressive's doing, how do we improve that? What's being done to like stop this anti-climate movement on the treasuries?
Well, it's kind of like you're asking the right person. That's mostly my job, is trying to improve things. I have to say, I've drafted a few model policies. I'd be happy to share them with you if you just send me an email, that I think ideally will be passed and adopted in Dem trifecta states. The challenge so far is that there's a lot of buy-in, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from climate organizations. There's a little bit less buy-in into the sort of theory that my theory that the best defense is a good offense from labor organizations. So labor, like AFT, SEIU, the building trades, they've been really vocal and very much at the forefront of opposing these nonsense anti-ESG bills where they've been introduced, but they haven't been so active in shaping these model policies that I've been trying to advance. And the consequence of them not being that engaged has been that in Colorado, for instance, where there was the good climate risk assessment bill that started to move, the labor organizations weren't against it, but they did express the view that Section 2, which aligned Colorado's proxy voting guidance with Colorado's climate targets, was going to be bad for returns. And there wasn't a lot of back and forth over kind of negotiating how language that they could support could be agreed to. And so that section of the bill got struck in the Colorado Senate Finance Committee. And so it's still probably going to be a bill that passes in Colorado this year, but it's a little bit weaker in part because labor organizations haven't been at the table from the beginning. And I don't mean to badmouth them, because I do believe very strongly that it's their money and they should have a stake in what's done with it. But I just mean, and partly it's, criticizing myself and my own coalition. We haven't really just been able to sort of sit down and get all the stakeholders to have consensus from the beginning. So that's what's really needed.
Okay. All right. Right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And
Thank you.
I'll let you know when this is posted. So
Thanks,
everyone, happy St. Patrick's Day coming up.
Yes.
Okay.
Good night.
Yes, good night all. Bye.
Night.